know the feeling when your brain feels like a radio with all the stations playing at once? For people with ADHD, this isn't just a moment, it's daily life. And it's a state that makes it challenging to fit into a world of rules, routines, and monotonous tasks. In the 1970s, only 1% of children were diagnosed with ADHD. Today, it's around 10% of children. So why is that? Is that due to better diagnostics, increased awareness, or actual changes? Are we truly changing biologically, psychologically, or maybe socially? Is it the modern environment overwhelming us? Constantly available news, monotonous tasks, chronic sitting, light and environmental pollution, industrialized and nutrient-poor and toxin-rich foods. Many of those things seem to increasingly be unsuitable for our old hunter-gatherer brains. The most common treatment currently for ADHD involves amphetamine-like stimulants such as Ritalin or actual amphetamines. But why do those stimulating medications, which are similar to the tank chocolate that we used to keep soldiers awake for during World War II, why do those stimulating substances help calm the brain? Well, interestingly, the brain requires more energy for rest and clarity than for chaotic thoughts. The frontal lobe, responsible for executive functions like impulse control and attention focus, and the cerebellum, sitting in the hind of our brains, responsible usually for movements but also for emotional and impulse regulation, they have an enormous energy demand. And when this energy is lacking, restlessness and chaos can emerge in the brain. And new approaches are raising the question, could ADHD be a problem of the brain's energy supply? Recent studies are investigating whether and how alternative energy sources, besides glucose, such as lactate from exercise or ketone bodies from the liver metabolism under specific nutrient circumstances, might improve brain metabolism and bring calm to the mind. Universities like Harvard, Stanford, and Oxford have even established dedicated departments for the so-called metabolic psychiatry. One thing is clear, ADHD is not just an individual problem, but a societal challenge. We must create environments that make neurobiological sense and give every brain the chance to express its talents. And we also must create an environment that nourishes brains optimally and appropriately. But what is that optimal nutrient supply for the brain? Today on MOJO Perspective Shift, we're speaking with Ali Houston, who has ADHD himself, and he's an expert in metabolic psychiatry. He explores how nutrition can really help regulate our brains. Ali, welcome to the show. Let's get right into it. What do you think? Is ADHD a problem of brain's energy metabolism? I'm really interested in your perspective on this.
Thank you, Garrett. Yeah, pleasure to be here. And it's a great question. And I think the answer to it is evolving all the time. So, in your introduction, you mentioned that there's a question mark about what is this big uptick in diagnosis of ADHD in children and in adults. Is it just a raised awareness, or is there really an increase in what's there? Is there maybe even an incentive to get a diagnosis so that for example, children might get more time in exams, or they might, have an excuse for something, perceived by the parents or the teachers or the school, and for adults, maybe it will help to make sense of negative past experiences, for example. So there's all sorts of reasons why people seek diagnosis, and there could be, in theory, multiple reasons why people have these symptoms. So I don't think it's a clear-cut yes or no answer, but my current opinion is that, put it this way, I don't think we evolved over millions of years and tens of thousands of generations to have a population-wide pathology in our ability to focus. Now, I don't think that should be a controversial statement. I also don't think that we evolved over millions of years and tens of thousands of generations to have a deficiency of stimulant medication. There's a kind of underlying assumption in much of medicine that we are fundamentally broken machines and have a genetic destiny in some way. And that even if there's an acknowledgement that there's a modern environmental mismatch with some of those genes, that, oh, well, there's nothing we can do about it. You've got ADHD because you were going to get ADHD, you'll always have ADHD. And out of that movement also arises this neurodiversity or neurospicy kind of owning of the symptoms as an identity. And I think that can be completely understood and empathized with. I certainly hoped that that was the case for me when I got my diagnosis, that it would be the answer that I needed to make sense of my other symptoms like depression and anxiety and uh, my underperformance compared to past experience where sometimes I felt capable and other times I really didn't. And I got disillusioned and began to look at other potential options when, the medication stopped working as well, and I had to take more to get the same effect. And even at those doses, it wasn't working as well as I wanted to. It didn't seem to be addressing an underlying root cause. It didn't address the other symptoms like anxiety and depression. It actually made the anxiety much worse sometimes. And so I fell out of this idea that I was sort of neurodiverse or neurospicy and that I should just sort of learn to live with it and own it. I do, however, think that there are ADHD traits which can be thought of as evolutionarily adapted. So think about the sort of the typical ADHD trait of enjoying novelty, new projects, and having multiple projects running at once. Now, I think that would make a very useful tool in a hunter-gatherer society. If you've got people who want to find new things and kind of experience them and tell everyone about them, and to try as many of these things out as possible. You can see automatically how that would be useful to a group. And even after my symptoms went away, when I switched to a ketogenic diet, I still felt like that. I still do feel like that. But I can control where I put my focus. My mood is high and even. My anxiety has dropped almost to zero. And I have a constant supply of energy. So I think in my personal experience, it seemed to certainly coincide that the negative ADHD symptoms or traits went away when I fixed my metabolism. Now, as we all know, an n equals 1 means that you can't extrapolate, but it was completely stark for me. And when I've gone off plan, certain traits have come back or symptoms. So
So
it
what
seems
is
to
it,
be.
Ellie? What is it that you have done to fix your metabolism?
So, as I was saying before we were recording, I originally was a physicist and I'd started a PhD in physics after working in industry for a few years. And one of my supervisors had healed his chronic fatigue syndrome for by going on a ketogenic diet. He went from bedridden, being told he probably wouldn't ever work again in his early 40s, to 6 months later running 10Ks again after going keto. So he went back to work, developed this deep side knowledge in nutrition, and was saying these strange things like margarine isn't food. Nobody should really be eating wheat. 5 a day was invented by marketers. And I was like, you know, if this wasn't a physics professor saying this, I would really question it. But I kind of learned through asking him questions and absorbing um, by reading the stuff that he was suggesting that I could certainly control my weight probably quite well. And that was also an issue that I had. So in March 2016, I thought, right, I'm doing it. I'm going on a ketogenic diet to control my weight. And then within several weeks, I noticed that my mood was just through the roof. It felt great. I didn't have anxiety. I had a lot of enthusiasm for life and hope for the future. And then come autumn 2016, I was really worried because typically, even if I felt okay in the summer, by the autumn, the seasonal depression would start to come in. And sometimes, I had suicidal ideations. It really wasn't good. I lost all motivation, etc. And it just didn't appear. And it hasn't come back since 2016. So I went on a ketogenic diet. I have found that not eating dairy is important for me to feel good mentally, although that's not the case for everyone. Um, and I have supplemented a fair bit along the way with various things. I quite like trying different supplements out to see if there's much of a difference, and it's always based on some solid reading around it and some mechanistic investigation. But I've maintained a slim figure and more or less around my target weight for the last nearly 9 years. And my mental health has been great all the time. So it was funny because at the time, hardly anyone was talking about that side of things. There was some kind of old school carnivore people and Georgia Ede who were writing about it. And it was a fringe thing, even though, especially Georgia, is so credible, Harvard educated, worked at Harvard, um, a practicing psychiatrist for many years, and yet here she was writing about nutrition and mental health. So I did other things in the space for a time, and then got into health coaching and more specifically mental health coaching more recently as the Bazooki Group came into the space and created this ecosystem really. So it happened very quickly for me. I made the decision to change my diet, not expecting there to be a clean sweep of mental health improvements. And it's just been really good since.
Fascinating. You didn't only go through your personal journey there, but you really became an expert, a go-to guy for other people seeking help. And you also researching this whole topic. This year, you're going to launch one of the first, if not the first, randomized control trials looking at how a ketogenic diet might help people with ADHD. What is your current understanding of why it might work? Or why it works for you specifically and why it might work for other people as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is the big open question. I think the intervention is something that people can understand in its basic form in a couple of minutes, right? You say they might even have heard of a keto diet or a low carb diet or an Atkins diet. And so they say, okay, well, that's the one where you cut out sugar and pasta and bread, right? And you say, yeah. And they say, oh, that can help mental health. And you think, well, yeah, it looks like it could. And so great, people can understand it in a couple of minutes. They can be coached to make it work effectively in their lives in a number of weeks. And if it works for them, it seems to really work. So what's going on there? And the difficult thing is that, and the sort of flip side of it being easy to understand, is that it actually is acting on dozens of pathways in the body. And so, which ones are the key pathways? You know, um, is it to do with microbiome manipulation? Is it to do with gut healing and therefore lower inflammation and immune reaction inside the body in the systemic bloodstream and in organs and all the rest of it? Um, is it simply the ketone supply to the brain is established and increased, where we know that the brain thrives on ketones compared to glucose, especially in people who have glucose hypometabolism, where they struggle to use the glucose they have because of um, insulin problems. And the list goes on, honestly. There's oxidative stress, nutrient deficiencies, etc. And I think all of these have plausible mechanisms and explanations and could be a part of the puzzle. The question is, to what extent does each one cause improvement, and in what symptom clusters, in what conditions, in what ages and types of bodies, and um, prior microbiome status, etc. So that is what is being investigated at an early stage. Because when I was writing the proposal for the study, I was looking for, like you say, there's not really anything in humans in using ketogenic diet for ADHD. And so I referenced the two studies in animal models, one in dogs and one in rats. And whatever ADHD means for dogs and rats, right? Um, and the professor I'm working with said, just take that out. It's the bar at the moment for evidence is very low. So I'm glad that we're doing a randomized controlled trial, because I think it's producing a level of evidence which is less easy to attack, like so many very exciting case studies and case series and retrospective analyses have been. And it's fair enough to say that's interesting. Let's get more rigorous studies, but we wanted to get to that randomized controlled trial stage as soon as we could. There are two others that I know of that are about to be underway or are underway. So it'll be interesting to see how they, corroborate. And one of them is in the Netherlands and in Leiden. It's Elena de Keester's group, and then Laura Saslow in the States is doing one that also has some funding from the Bazooki Group. So it'll be really interesting to see how these um, talk to each other. The Laura Saslow one, I don't think she's looking at depression symptoms, but the one in Leiden is. So it's quite similar, except their control group is a paleo diet group, which is super interesting because you might expect the gap between the effect, if there is an effect, to be smaller in that study between ketogenic diet and paleo diet group. For example, you might find that it's not the ketones, that it's really just removing things like um, gluten, dairy, things that can mess with gut health, that is the sort of Pareto dominant uh, mechanism, so that you just do that
Yeah.
and maybe you get lots of the benefits. There's also a really interesting study on bipolar disorder and schizophrenia in Australia, run by Carlo Longitano and Zoltan Sarnay. And they're doing a randomized controlled trial where it's ketogenic diet versus um, a kind of Australian Mediterranean diet. It's um it's a standardized version of a kind of a Mediterranean diet, and the early results seem to be showing that actually that's quite good and it can help people with their mental health, but probably not as much as with the ketones. So
Yeah.
it's really cool to see all these studies emerging where you can start to get a sense of which mechanisms are contributing the most. And I think for ours, uh, we're going to be comparing a ketogenic diet with a kind of dietary guidelines type of diet, where it be healthy whole grains, so called, and um, you know, 5 a day, and not much meat, and you're allowed to have junk food once in a while, that kind of thing, but also with a component on top called the hormesis diet, which is about phytonutrients and stressing the body in the short term to gain in the long term. And it'll be really interesting to see how they compare. And it won't necessarily tell us as much about the mechanisms, but we are investigating microbiome analysis before and after. We're going to be looking at various blood markers. We're going to be looking at daily ketones and glucose, and we should get an idea of how these things maybe correlate. And
Yeah.
it's a start.
Yeah, it's an awesome start to have a randomized controlled trial looking at this, because there's many anecdotes out there of people who have found help in the field of metabolic psychiatry. But certainly it's important to have randomized controlled trials and look at that. And you also raised an important point of maybe having the next question, like what is the minimum effective dose? Because a ketogenic diet can be a very harsh transition to make. And if there's a less minimum, you always want to have a medication with the least minimal effective dose, and then every person can decide for themselves whether they want to go further or not. But from a therapeutic perspective, to find that minimum effective dose is really important. What is from a really practical perspective, because you are coaching those people in the study through with you and your health coaches, and you have a lot of experience from the practical side. What do you think are the most important factors, specifically addressing the viewers who might have a child who has ADHD or who might have ADHD themselves, and they are looking, what can I really do, and what are the foundational building blocks that I really have to address, and what is kind of optional so I can really fit it into my daily life?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I always start when I coach people by asking, what foods do they really love? And then we work out what foods love them back. Because I think a lot of clients come to the process assuming that I'll be like a sergeant major and they'll be told what to do and they have to stick to the program. And if they don't, they're bad children. And it's the opposite. I want to know what they like to do. And, we move towards this kind of position where they're doing things they really like to do and that fit in with their health goals. So they're really held accountable to what they've told me they like and they want to do. And I think that makes it really powerful and really individualized. So when it comes to children, I haven't worked with children at all, and neither's Georgia Eid. She's worked with young adults in a kind of university setting, but we'll be focusing on adults, and I think that in a way that's harder because if adults are finding that it's them, not their kids, that have the ADHD, I think sometimes they're in it. It's a bit like your brain being the thing you're trying to measure and affect is also the thing that controls your ability to do so. So sometimes it feels like a bit of a vicious circle, and you have to sort of break that cycle. So I think the fundamentals are really giving someone the space to tell you what they want to achieve and asking them which information they would like in order to help them to do that. And then when they have the information, supporting them to apply it.
Yeah.
And it's a bit vague, but I think the how they specify these things makes the intervention much more powerful.
Yeah, and one last question going into the details, maybe on a substance perspective. What is your take on, what do you think? Like, how intense should somebody do it? Is it enough to just leave out junk food? Does it have to be reduced junk food and also reduced carbs, maybe measured with a glucose monitor? Or how important do you think is it really to get the measurable ketosis with ketone levels above a certain threshold? What is your take on that?
I think we don't know yet. And I
Mm.
think from a sort of client perspective, there is tension between wanting to make a change to help yourself and the difficulty in applying certain changes to your own life. And, stuff always happens, stress happens. You want to hit that button and just, eat and drink all the stuff that you've said you don't want to eat and drink. And people have to find where their personal lines are. Now, I think potential ideal scenario is that someone does an elimination diet, where I think that the perfect elimination diet is a form of carnivore diet where you focus on beef, lamb, seafood, fish, maybe eggs if you don't have a problem with eggs, and start from there. But that's the gold standard, and you can really find out a lot about yourself by reintroducing things. And I think there's no reason that anyone needs to eat gluten, that especially if you have a history of autoimmune or gut problems or mental health problems, that it's potentially dangerous, but some people still want to eat it. And so there is this tension where some people will have a line which is that they have a cheat day, and some people can't do that. And it's maybe because it makes them feel bad for 5 days. So what's the point in having a cheat day once a week? But it's maybe because they actually have a problem with addictive style behavior around food, and that it triggers them to just completely, press the button and abandon what they've done, feeling ashamed and unable to continue. So I think abstinence can work for a lot of people. And that's another thing which is great about a ketogenic diet over, say, a paleo style diet, or just trying to cut down on ultra processed food or something like that, is that there's much clearer lines
Mm-hmm.
for someone who has a problem controlling the amount that they eat of these things or when they do it. And I think that's a process, and that's why coaching helps so much. That's why if someone wanders into a Facebook group, or a Reddit, a subreddit, or a Twitter thread, or a newspaper article about one of these things, and decides to do it themselves and finds it very difficult and says that doesn't work for me, that is such a shame, because I think the connective tissue of this process is the support that people get that they sometimes really need for the first 6 to 12 weeks. And that if they get that and they're told, how can you get the right types of fats into your diet? How can you find out what foods really work for you? What supplements might help? What ones are likely to just be expensive and not do anything or make you worse? What kind of lifestyle interventions are cost effective and can really move the needle and can stack with very low or no risk on top of all the other stuff, including diet. And I think that sort of hope that people get and sense of achievement when it starts to work just compounds until
Yeah.
they think, well, why would I go back?
Yeah.
And it doesn't always have to be keto, but there's a clear signal between feeling markedly better in your mental health, between just cutting down on ultra processed foods versus a ketogenic diet versus carnivore. And
Yes.
um, we haven't got enough data to properly systematize that yet or quantify it yet, but it's absolutely clear from all of the practitioners in this area that that is the case.
Yes, yes. From my experience, I can confirm that, and it's great advice that you said to go with it in the terms of elimination diet, achieve a symptom reduced or even symptom free state. Then you know where you can get with this type of intervention, and from there reintroduce and find your personal individual threshold of what is my personal minimum effective dose. And you also raised a really important point that all these changes are so much easier when you have the group, when you have this community cure, when you have an expert like you can really guide you through, because there's certain humps like electrolytes and enzymes and all those things that can be humps with a change like this. So it's really great that you offer metabolic coaching programs. You have metabolic psychiatry coaching programs. We're going to put the link to your coaching programs in the show notes. I'm really excited on the trials that are coming up. We're going to also put the links in the show notes, and I was so glad to have you on the show, and it's just awesome. You had your own struggle with things, you found your own solution, you let your curiosity guide you, and now you're a beacon of hope and somebody who can people can come to, and you're an expert for other people in this field, and that's really inspiring. Thank you for being on the show, Ali.
Thanks, Garrett. Very kind words, and love the work you're doing, and looking forward to engaging with your audience.